Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to do this. My name's Amy Bucher, and I am the VP of Behavior Change Design at MadPow. And I put my contact information there on the front slide. So both my email address and then my Twitter handle. If you reach out to me, I may not always be the fastest to respond, but I'm usually pretty happy to meet new people and email and chat, or through whatever modality that works for you. So yeah, I wrote a book. This is it. Engaged, Designing for Behavior Change. It's with Rosenfeld Media, which is actually a publisher that I learned about through my involvement in UXPA and then UXPA Boston, which is my home chapter. So I first read a Rosenfeld book as a result of encountering them at, it was probably UXPA Boston conference, because I believe that was my entree into the UXPA world. And I just really like their books. I think they do a really nice job of putting out books that are actionable and practical, and well edited was very important to me. And so when I got to a point where I was interested in writing a book myself, they were one of the first publishing houses that I thought of. And fortunately, I was able to work with them and make it happen. So this is the book. It's available in both the typical Rosenfeld paperback and e-reader versions on either Rosenfeld Media or Amazon. Of course, the world being what it is and wanting to support small businesses, I'd encourage you to buy from Rosenfeld Media if you're interested. And we do have a discount code for UXPA members that's on the screen right now. So UXPA 0620, just the month and the year, for 20% off. And that code is good through the end of the year. And Lou Rosenfeld has asked me to make sure that I get better about asking people to who have read it to please review it on Amazon or Goodreads, because that does make a difference in whether or not people encounter it in the first place. But the reason I wanted to write this book was I have a PhD in psychology. I was academically trained, and I finished my degree in 2006, and I went pretty much immediately into the product research and design world. And a lot of those skills were really new to me and things that I was learning on the job. So I felt like I was starting off being a behavior scientist who gradually became a behavior change designer. And as I got a little bit more mature in that craft, creating it and figuring out what it meant for me in terms of my work, first of all, there were folks like, UXPA and UXPA Boston that were really instrumental in educating me around the design piece of it. So, that was a community that I did and continue to learn a lot from. And it's also a community where I found people were increasingly reaching out and saying, hey, you do a really interesting variation on design. Like, the thing you do is kind of unique and cool, and how do I do it too? And my instinct is always to try to point people to a book or a resource. But for the particular type of job I was doing, I couldn't find one that was right for that audience. So there was a lot of stuff that someone who has the PhD in psychology might be willing to parse through and sort of get at some of the psychology principles. And there's a lot of great design resources out there, but I really couldn't find one that did both. And so I wanted to create that resource to help people who are interested in bringing specifically motivational psychology into the way that they do design, whether they're researchers or product managers or whatever other role. So I put together a brief presentation about what I think behavior change design is, and it is a lot of stuff that comes from the first chapter of this book. But as I was saying to the crew earlier before we started the formal webinar, I've built a couple of exit points into it. So if there's a lot of activity in the Q&A box, I can stop presenting and we can just chat. But I found it is helpful because this is, as I said, kind of a growing and new and still forming area of design to provide that background. So with that, what does a behavior change designer do? And one of the things that I've found, even when I was studying psychology, is that people who don't have a background in behavior science have some misconceptions about what it is and what you're able to do with it. So I have had people say to me like, oh, well, first of all, one thing that has happened that is kind of funny is people will sometimes confuse it with being psychic. And they'll say, oh, you can read my mind. What am I thinking? And like, no, psychology, not psychic. But another thing that is very common, and I think unfortunately made more common by some of the high profile misuses of behavior science, is this idea that it can be used to control people, that you can build things into your products that will cause people to behave in a way that they may not be aware of, or they may not be bought into, that they're doing it avolitionally. And I want to say at the outset that that is not what I consider to be a behavior change designer. I think that just as the larger design community has a code of ethics that we're working to really codify and make part of the way we do work, within behavior change design, we similarly have a code of ethics that precludes us from forcing people to do things that they don't want to do, from being sneaky about the way that we do design. And I actually blogged about this recently because I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I do think that having formal training in psychology helps with this, because if you do human subjects research within a psychology paradigm, you have to go through quite a bit of ethics training around human subjects research and how to approach that and how to really get that informed consent. And I find that I bring that into my work as a behavior change designer, and it complements very nicely some of the ethics that exist in the product world. So I really, do not consider any kind of forceful or sneaky manipulation to be good behavior change design. And it's something I actively try to avoid in my own work and discourage others from doing. So what is it? I think behavior change designers are people who facilitate the ability of people, their users, to work towards goals by designing interventions that address barriers to target behaviors and promote conditions that are favorable to target behaviors. And I bolded the words goals and interventions here because they're kind of important vocabulary. Interventions is a broad term that I use to mean basically anything that I design, anything that's intended to affect people's behavior, I consider an intervention. And then goals I bolded, I think we all have an understanding of what goals are, but to my point about not being a puppet master, part of what we're doing as behavior change designers is understanding our users, understanding what goals they have for themselves, and then figuring out how we can build our product in a way that supports them in pursuing those. So the goals have to belong in some form to the user. And we can help shape those and articulate them. We can, perhaps put new attractive goals in front of them that they may not have thought of and give them the opportunity to adopt those goals as their own. But ultimately, we really can't impose goals on people. And so I like to just highlight that it's a really important aspect of behavior change design to know what people want to do. And I consider behavior change designer as living in the world that exists in between UX and behavior science. I really draw from both toolkits in my day-to-day job, which I think is awesome. It's one of my favorite parts of my job, that I get to have a foot in both worlds and really think about how to combine them. In terms of the nuts and bolts of what I do in my day job, I have talked to a lot of other people who do behavior change design in a lot of organizations, and we all have a process and we all have different names for the process, but they do all ultimately follow the same pattern of steps. And I've seen a different number of steps from different people, so they're not even identical in terms of how you break them down. But this is the process that we use at MadPow. So, and I really like the way that it's laid out. It works well for me, and I like the language that we use here too. It initially came from the fact that we do a lot of healthcare work. So you can see there's kind of a healthcare echo to the language that we use for our stages. But it's a 4-step process, and I put the arrows at the top. I say it's a 4-step process, but the one piece of this that I've never really been able to create a good visual for is the fact that evaluation happens throughout the process. We're always doing testing and research at every step of the way, and you know that from being in any design role, really. The behavior change design process starts with what we call diagnosis or diagnosing, and that's where we do our formative research to really understand the problem state. That might include a literature review oftentimes with behavior change design. I think that's one of the differentiators. So, I often am going into research databases to see what types of papers have been published in the past on a topic area and seeing what I can learn from them. What has worked in the past that I should incorporate into my process, and what might I want to stay away from because there's really very poor evidence for it, or maybe even evidence that it doesn't tend to work well. We also want to do our own initial research with the people that we're designing for and with, because as good as a research paper can be, chances are it wasn't done with our group of users or in this context at this time. Right now with coronavirus, actually, I'm feeling that there's even more of a need than ever to do some of this formative research with every project, because it's such an impactful situation, right? It's affecting every aspect of people's lives. And so we really need to understand their experience in the moment instead of assuming that research from before this event is still applicable. Once we've formed a good idea of what the problem state might be, then we get into the prescription or prescribe phase. And this is where we start to think about solutioning. And so this is where, again, we might go to the literature and see, based on what we've understood about the situation, are there certain solution sets that might work for us? We start to put together some concepts. We might start testing those concepts to see which ones are most desirable for people, which ones maybe fit their life context the best. But that's what we're doing here, is we're trying to get into solutioning. Once we've narrowed down what we want our solution to be, we get into implementation. So that's actually building it. And then finally, evaluation is our outcomes research. And as I said, we do testing all along the way. So I always feel like it's a little misleading to just put it at the end, but we do specifically want to look at outcomes once our intervention is out in the world. So whether that is building data collection into an app, for example, so that we're collecting ongoing data about what people are doing as they use it, or sometimes it means that we plan a separate study that we do. So maybe we want to go do an interview study or a survey study or some kind of other outcome study once this thing has been out in the world and see how it's affected people's behaviors. Mention that interventions are, that's the catch-all term I use for anything that I work on. And when we think about what they do, it's not just, do they do this behavior? Yes, no. We can affect that. That's the first bullet here. So it can affect what people do. It can introduce a new behavior into their repertoire, or it can remove one. We see a lot of examples of products that are designed to break bad habits. Think about quitting smoking. But it can also affect how often they do it. So a lot of times we're targeting behaviors that people are already doing, and we're trying to make them do them more or less often. It can affect how long they do it for, when they do it, and all kinds of other details about what that behavior looks like. But ultimately, they do target a behavior. And I found it's helpful to give a couple of examples of what an intervention might be versus what it might not be. So these are 4 screenshots from apps that are definitely interventions. They are specifically intended to affect specific behaviors among their users. So there's Nagbot. It's basically, the user does a lot of setup here. They put in what their goal is and they tell Nagbot how often they want to be reminded about it. And then they get text messages from the bot on their preferred schedule that says like, hey, you said you would do this thing. Are you doing the thing? Wobot's really cool. It is a chatbot, an AI-powered chatbot that does cognitive behavioral therapy type conversation with people who are experiencing low mood. And it's specifically intended to get them to change some of their thought patterns and behaviors that are associated with low mood. So it's a behavioral health app. Headspace, a lot of people are familiar with. It's a mindfulness and meditation app. That's the behavior it's trying to target. It's trying to get people to do that, either for the first time or more often. And then the last one here is Stash Invest. And this is intended for people who've never done any sort of investing with their money, but now want to, more aggressively save. And so it provides some coaching to help novice investors figure out how to put their money into different types of accounts. And that's the behavior it's trying to target investing. Contrast with a couple here. And these are actually all apps I use and like. So when I say something's not an intervention, I'm not trying to insult it. I'm just saying that's not the category it lives in. The first one's Untapped. It's a beer drinking log that I use because I really like trying new beers, and I found I wasn't remembering which ones I'd tried. And it does a lot of stuff with badging and progress that makes it look like it might be a behavior change app, but really it's not trying to affect a behavior. It's not really trying to guide you to drink any particular beer or even drink beer more. It's just sort of an informational app. Spotify. So Spotify in and of itself, not a behavior change app. It's not really trying to get you to do anything besides use it. And then Facebook is one that I think is an interesting case because there are a lot of behavior change interventions that can be built into Facebook, or it can be used as a social support aspect to an intervention. But again, in and of itself, as a standalone, it's not intended to change behavior. So I find it's helpful to just go through what an intervention is and isn't. A key thing about behavior change design is the very first thing that we do with pretty much every project is figure out what behaviors we're trying to target. So behaviors come first. And there's some discipline associated with going through that exercise and figuring out, what are the behaviors that I would like to see my users do or do differently as a result of experiencing this product. We work a lot with our clients to try to figure out the types of outcomes they're hoping to achieve. And then part of our research is often saying, okay, if our client's trying to have this ROI, or if they're trying to, see a lower emergency room utilization among their health plan members, what are the behaviors that need to happen in order for that outcome to be real? So that definitional work has to come first. And part of it is understanding what is and is not a behavior. So I use this a lot. If you've seen me present before, you might have seen a version of this, but I like to ask people which ones are behaviors, because this list of things are all sort of worthy goals. They're all, kind of like good for you things that you might want people to do, but they're not all behaviors. And so when we go through a behavior change design project, we're really trying to hone in on the ones that are behaviors, because those are the things that tend to be a little bit easier to affect. And they also tend to be easier to measure. And measuring our outcomes so that we can iterate and improve is a really important thing. So I'll just show you what the answers are here. Walking in the park, taking a pill, reading a chapter a night, saving $100 a month, and practicing Spanish vocabulary are all behaviors. They're very concrete. They're things that you can probably observe or easily measure. You can know if a person did them or not. The ones that are not behaviors are things like feeling confident, wanting to make a change, being happy. Those are emotional states. They can affect behaviors. They may be something that we want to consider, but in and of themselves, they're a little bit difficult to measure. They're a little squishy, like what does it even mean to be happy? So we have a difficult time being precise around them, and we wouldn't want to make them the sole target of our intervention. Losing weight is a fun one because with health-related stuff, it comes up a lot, but it's not a behavior, it's an outcome. So we want to really focus on the behaviors that lead to that. If we just say losing weight, that denies us the precision that we might have around helping people with, eating differently or moving their bodies differently. And then preparing for retirement, I put in red, because this is another example of one that just would need a little bit more work to get precise. What does preparing for retirement mean? It probably means something like saving money or setting up a certain type of account, or maybe even just creating an Excel spreadsheet that has a certain type of information in it. We need to get to that level in order to have it as a good design target. I see here, there's a question, and I think it fits in here as well. Like, what is the difference between behavior change design and human-centered design process? And I can say that at MadPow, we've put some thought into that question, because MadPow started as a human-centered design organization and then added this behavior change design capability about 10 years ago. And so we think of behavior change design as a type of human-centered design that specifically draws on frameworks and tools from the behavior change literature. So I think of it as a flavor of human-centered design. And in fact, one of the things that I have learned a lot about in my career outside of school is human-centered design and using those techniques and tools as a way to do behavior change. So I hope that's helpful. I realize there's a lot of overlap, and I think we're trying to take advantage of that overlap. Both of them really do put the human, the user, at the center of the process, and I think that's a good thing. All right, so with which ones are behaviors? Usually we end up with a huge list of behaviors. Like, we could change 100 behaviors with this, but that's not really feasible or realistic for a given project. So we have to go through a process of narrowing it down. And typically what we do is we ask a few questions. So, okay, if we're going to prioritize these behaviors, first of all, which ones are actually going to drive those outcomes? So I mentioned before, like, we often will have healthcare clients, and a very real thing they might ask for is, I don't want people using the emergency room as much. I would like them to make a doctor's appointment in advance. I would like them to use telehealth. I would like them to not wait until something is an emergency. And so we would say, all right, well, why are they doing that? Like, why is this a problem? And then typically in our research, we'll end up finding a smaller set of behaviors that really are the drivers of that outcome. And so that helps us figure out what we should focus in on. So that's the first question, like, what is actually driving that outcome? Do we have access to the people who do that behavior? Like, are they the users? So we've actually had this issue before. One project that I worked on that I loved was about construction worker safety behaviors. Our client had the ability to provide training to construction workers. So they said, you know, we know that it might not entirely be a training issue, but like, training is the tool we have. So whatever you end up with, like, it's got to fit in the training. And we did find in our research that there were some issues in terms of culture that were organizational culture that were affecting safety. So basically, there would sometimes be supervisors who had like 30 years experience and were super confident and would like kind of do whatever. And the newer workers would look at them and think like, why do I have to do all the safety stuff? Well, unfortunately, that our client's toolkit of training didn't let us affect that particular dynamic. So that was not a target behavior, even though it was a really important behavioral dynamic. And actually that gets into the third question here, which is, can we influence them in the constraints of our toolkit? Like, do we actually have the power to build something that affects that? And the answer sometimes is no. And that means that that's probably not a good target behavior for our project. Just another question in here. My understanding is human-centered design process does not necessarily result in behavior change. Is that correct? That's also my understanding. So that's another way that behavior change design maybe is a little bit different than human-centered design, or a little bit focused within it, we are always seeking to change a behavior. Where human-centered design in general, I think, might just, it could be to create a better experience for people that doesn't necessarily cause them to do anything differently, but causes their, experience of it to be better. So yes, I think that's correct. All right, so once we've selected that target behavior, it anchors the entire process. Like, we're really building around that. And a tool that I have found useful, and I will tell you, actually, I resisted this because I'm not a quant person. And this is a pretty quantitative tool, but I've learned over the years of my career that going through the exercise of building something like this out at the beginning of every project really helps to create that discipline and create that focus. So the outcomes plan helps make sure that we are measuring the right behaviors and that those behaviors are going to track to the outcomes that we hope to achieve. So the first box, actually, this is generic. We want to measure baseline. We want to know what the current state is, because otherwise we'll never know what kind of effect we had. The long-term outcomes often come from a client. I work in consulting, so I'm going to use this client language. If you're in-house, it might be something that your organization has set, but these are sort of like the big, hairy, like, how do we know if we were successful type of metrics? Those two middle boxes are where I think the behavior change designer does the most creative work, because it's figuring out, okay, what are the behaviors that need to happen to achieve those long-term outcomes? And then how do I have to deliver my intervention in order to affect those behaviors? So just to show you, and these are in the book, by the way, these two diagrams I took directly from the book. But imagine you were building something, an app that was going to help people with high blood pressure to reduce their blood pressure. So you would want to measure all of their health metrics day one. And often that happens in onboarding. So as people start using an app, you might give them a pretty lengthy survey that asks them to provide this information. Depending on how this product gets implemented, it might be something that your client has available. So I will often work with a health plan or a hospital where they'll say, like, we actually have the health data for these 300 people, build an app and give it to them, and then we'll measure the outcomes of those 300 people a year down the road. So sometimes the product designer doesn't have to measure these things, but if you do want to measure them, often during onboarding is a good time to do it. The long-term outcomes that a client might have, they're usually associated with reducing costs. People want a return on their investment, and they're usually associated with something about improving health. So in this case, they want to see that people are actually reducing their blood pressure, cost savings from less ER use. I keep saying that because it is a really big thing for health clients, whether it's a health plan or a hospital system or a provider system. And then fewer heart attacks and strokes, because if you have high blood pressure and it goes unchecked for a long time, you might have one of those health events, and those are really catastrophic for the individual oftentimes, and they're really expensive to treat. So we want to avoid those. Those are our big, hairy, long-term outcomes. All right, so what has to happen for those to achieve? And what I wanted to point out here is there's a lot of behaviors that are repeat or sustained behaviors. So we want to see people getting regular exercise. It's not a one-time thing. So you've got to become someone who takes a walk every night after dinner if you want to have that beneficial health effect. If you're on a medication, you've got to take that as prescribed, which could be forever. But some of these things are more episodic. So you got to make the doctor's appointment. You've got to fill the prescription. And if you think about these behaviors in this detail and you're taking that design lens, this is where now you're making decisions about what goes in the guts of the product. So if you know that making that doctor's appointment is really important, you're going to want to build something into your product that prompts people to make the doctor's appointment, or maybe even helps them do it. ME Solutions had a really cool pilot a couple years ago where they did outbound phone calls to people who were due for medical tests, and then they automatically connected them to the scheduling office. Seems like a little thing, but they got a huge boost in people actually making the appointments because they just made it so easy. So that's the kind of thing that this helps you think about. And then participation and engagement. These are we call them exposure metrics. Like, are people actually getting exposed to the interventions? And I think that as designers, we tend to be pretty good about thinking about these things. How do we make our apps usable and fun and interesting so that people actually download them and get in there and click around? So that stuff is important because it's how you deliver the change. So I mentioned one of the differences between behavior change design and human-centered design is that we use those behavior change theories and frameworks. This is a non-inclusive list. I just put it to make the point that there are a lot of these. The ones with stars are ones that I encounter more often in my work. And I will say I never, ever, ever start with like this lengthy of a list when I'm doing a project. I think over the course of time, you become an expert in a handful of these. And you also learn that some of these are more or less applicable to the types of projects you work on. So there are a lot of theories out there, but you don't need to go through the process of winnowing down this exhaustive list every time. Instead, what I do basically with my smaller list is I think, all right, of the 4 or 5 frameworks that I am really comfortable using, that I have a really strong toolkit with, which one is the most applicable to this topic or problem area? And does the evidence base have relevance for the thing that I'm working on right now? So there's actually some really good theories out there that have only been studied in 1 or 2 domains. One that I see a lot is stages of change. A lot of people are familiar with that. And there's ideas from stages of change that show up in other theories. And in general, I think that it's totally true that people change when they're ready to change. But actually, one thing that a lot of people don't know is that the research base around stages of change, it's really, really strong in smoking cessation, and it's not super strong in a lot of other areas. So if I'm working on a project that's around, like, say, construction safety, stages of change may not be a good theory for me to use because there's just not a lot of research that's been done in that area. It's not the strongest theory for that approach. And then the last one here is really important too, right? Because we're designers. We're not just researchers. We're not just trying to find out information for information's sake. We're trying to learn so that we can build something that actually has an effect in the world. And so I want to make sure that whatever framework I use is going to give me something practical for the problem that I'm working on. And some of the frameworks sometimes are going to just be kind of like thought exercises, and that's not going to be right for a designer. So I'm going to briefly talk about 2 that I use all the time, and it's going to actually help me get into some of the questions that I see. So the first one's COM-B. This comes from University College of London. Susan Mickey and her team there have built this. It's a relatively new model. I think it was first published in 2012. So around the beginning of that decade. And the idea at the heart of it is pretty simple. It's very intuitive. The idea is that in order to do any behavior, and you have to define that behavior, people have to have the capability, the motivation, and the opportunity to perform it. And I really like this. And then there's a second part of this theory called the behavior change wheel framework. Actually, it's not a theory. The second part of the framework called the behavior change wheel, where they've done an exhaustive review of behavior change studies. And they found that based on whatever you find missing in people's capability, opportunity, or motivation, there's a certain set of solutions that tend to work. So if someone lacks the psychological ability to do a behavior, psychological ability, that just basically means knowledge, right? If they don't have the knowledge of how to do something, well, guess what? Education can be a really helpful set of tools to explore to help with that particular problem. That one's very obvious. They're not all quite as obvious. Motivation has 2 components in this particular framework. Reflective motivation is the way that we all talk about it. So it's, do people want to do something? Is it a goal for them? Automatic motivation, I always think of it as like the water to a fish. It's kind of the mental models that you have of how the world works and how do they affect your willingness or interest in doing a behavior. And that's something that is very culturally bound. It's very individual. And as a researcher, it often takes a lot of work to understand what people's mental models might be. But sometimes there are things there that are prohibiting people from doing a behavior, and we want to understand those. And then opportunity is both the physical and the social environment. So what is the context in which people are doing this behavior? And do we need to think about changing that context to change the behavior? So that's one theory. One of the things I really like about this is you can structure your research around it. So you can actually ask research questions, or if you're doing observation, you can build into your guide questions around capability, opportunity, and motivation. Some of these things are actually super observable too. I mean, the physical environment is a great example of the built environment. And then on the flip side, when you transition into a solutioning process, that behavior change wheel helps you link what you found in the research to your ideation activity. So I find this is a really practical theory. The second one that I use a lot, and I actually structured the book around this. So this is my favorite one. And this gets to a question that is in the chat here, which is, do we want to change behavior because we want this or our users want this? So the heart of self-determination theory, this is a motivation theory, and it says basically that the source of people's motivation matters a lot. If we want people to keep up a behavior, if we want them to keep doing it when it's challenging to do, they need to be doing it for their own reasons that are personally meaningful. And so that's what's on the right-hand side here with autonomous. The theory breaks down the different reasons why people might be motivated and arranges them along this continuum, going from controlled, which is it's coming from outside. And actually, it starts with I'm not motivated at all, no interest. And this is where it relates to stages of change too, right? If someone has absolutely no interest, it's gonna be really, really hard to get them to do anything. And so usually those are not people who are a design target. But let's say someone is interested because there's a reward on the line, right? I get, I get a check from my health insurance company if I do this exercise program. That will get people to do it. That's your external motivation there. But what we find, what research finds, is that if it becomes challenging to do that exercise program, people won't stick with it. And if the reward is removed, people won't stick with it. So it's not a really long-term sustaining form of motivation. So we want to look for things over here on the autonomous side. We want to find out what are the things people value? What are the goals that they have for themselves? And I mean goals in like that really important way, not, I got to finish my to-do list, but I want to be a good parent, or it's really important to me that I'm successful at this job because, that's how I think of myself. If we can understand those things about a person, then we can help to connect the behaviors that we're trying to get people to do to those things that matter to them. And so as a consultant, part of my job is actually understanding the business outcomes that my clients want, but then also the goals that my users have and trying to see where they may overlap. Usually there is an overlap. That's the good news. The challenge then is you have to talk about that overlap space in language that works for each audience. So you don't want to say to your users like, hey, we're trying to get a return on investment here. That's not language that they care about. You want to frame it in terms of improving their quality of life or helping them with their goals or whatever it is that's important to them. So the second piece of this, and this is where the book really kind of follows this pattern, is that you can create experiences, you can design things that are motivating to people so that they stick with them and over time connect more deeply with these autonomous forms of motivation. And the trick to doing that is supporting their fundamental psychological needs. So one thing I will say is a struggle with behavior change design is some of the scientific terminology, it like does not roll off the tongue. These are, you might see this sometimes abbreviated as BPNs, basic psychological needs. But the research that's been done over the last 40 or so years has found that people universally, and this truly is universally, they've done this research cross-culturally, there's a little bit of variation in how these show up in different cultures, but generally everybody has these three things that they seek out in their experience, and it's autonomy, or making your own meaningful choices, competence, which is, you want to make sure that when you're doing something, it has an effect in the world. You want to make a ripple, you want to make a splash. And then relatedness, feeling connected to other people. So in the book, I have a couple of chapters actually that are about specific design techniques that can support each of these three basic psychological needs. One of the things I love about this theory, one of the reasons that I reach for it so often, is that it's about 40 years old, as I mentioned. It comes out of the work of DC and Ryan, who a lot of people have heard of. And they've just done so much applied work with it. They've really explored how it can be used in sports and in health and in finance and in video games and education. And so there's a real wealth of knowledge about what works and what doesn't in terms of building experiences that support these needs. And I find that as a result of that, it's just a really successful approach to building products that people like and enjoy and use and that ultimately work for them. So those are two examples of frameworks that I use a lot. And both of them I do go into quite a bit of detail in the book. This is just some of what a lit review might look like. Building the thing. So this is from Panacea Digital. She did a really, really nice job building out examples of what different behavior change techniques might look like. So that behavior change technique is just kind of like the active ingredients in an intervention. What are you doing in order to, make this thing work? And they can be a little bit conceptual. And so this is a great resource if you want to check it out, where she actually built out screens that show what these might look like in an app. And they're intended to be generic just to get the idea a little bit more concrete in people's mind. Part of what a behavior change designer does, though, in that transition from the prescription to the implementation part of the process is work to make these things concrete. In my case, I don't have a visual design or an interaction design skill set, so I'm partnering with people in my organization who do have those skills. Other behavior change designers might also have those skills and be doing this work themselves. But either way, I stay connected with the work to make sure that what shows up in our prototypes, in our product, actually reflects the science correctly. And then once something is launched, we want to test it and make sure that it works. And so I mentioned before that there's all kinds of ways we can do this. This just lists some of the different approaches that we might take to it. And they are ordered here from the most hardcore and expensive and time involved to the easiest. And I did want to just say randomized control trials are considered the gold standard. It's basically, I mean, that's what the FDA does with clinical trials, basically, to make sure that medication works for people. We can do it with products as well, but they do tend to be quite expensive. And the drawback to them actually is that they don't reflect real world usage. They're structured in such a way that you can isolate everything except the one variable and say with a lot of confidence, like, hey, this thing worked or it didn't work. But the fact is that most of our products in the real world, like people might be combining it with other stuff they're doing, or they may be using it just sometimes and not as much as we want them to, or there's all kinds of variation in the way that people use products. And so these quasi-experimental studies and real-world comparisons can have a lot of value in showing us what happens when people actually use the product in the real world. It's a little bit less scientifically pure, but I think it's actually more reflective of what actually happens. And as a designer versus a pure scientist, I value that a lot. The thing that I always tell people, because again, like I'm not a quant person, I know a lot of people aren't, and it can be easy to get intimidated when you think about like, how do I show that this thing works? You're writing a story. You want to tell a story to people about your product and what it does in the world. And so when you think about collecting outcomes, think about what you need to tell that story. And I found that for me, that's really, really helpful. So I'll pause there, I guess. There's one question here that I wanted to get to from Dee, which was about whether I've done many motivational interviews. So yes, I have. And you can put in the chat box maybe, or unmute yourself to say if I'm getting this right. But there's actually an approach called motivational interviewing, MI, which is a clinical technique basically that people use in counseling to help, help basically people find their own motivation. So it has, I've given entire workshops on it, but a lot of the idea is that you want change talk to come from the person. You don't want to say to somebody, you have to do this thing. You want to ask them questions that lead them to that conclusion on their own. And it gets back to that idea from self-determination theory that self-generated motivation is the most powerful motivation. So you might ask questions that are, really gentle, like, okay, tell me more about that. Another thing that you see a lot with motivational interviewing is you might ask people, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how motivated are you to do this thing? And no matter what the person says, you have a follow-up question. So if they say 8, you say, oh, interesting. Why isn't that a 7? Because they're at the high end of the scale. And if you get them to reflect on why it is so high, they kind of double down on it. But if they're at the low end of the scale, you can ask them, okay, well, why isn't it higher? And then that starts getting them thinking about change talk. Like, what would need to be different in my life for me to have a higher motivation? Either way, you get something useful out of that conversation. So I've used motivational interviewing in building digital products. We build a lot of that language pattern into the way that we talk to our users. One thing that I found there's a lot of factors affecting like what type of data you might want to collect from people. And sometimes using the rhetorical questions that are part of a live motivational interviewing session can be really helpful in getting your users to think about something that you can't actually interact with them about. Like I've done a lot of work for pharma companies and they are very reluctant to collect free-form data from people. And so we found rhetorical questions are really helpful when we're building in that environment because we can at least get people thinking about this stuff, even if we can't collect the data to then have more of a conversation with them. And I also use it a lot when I do research. So when we have research participants talk to us and we do individual interviews, we're not using motivational interviewing as a clinician, but we're borrowing a lot of those techniques so that we can gently guide people to talk about things that may be a little bit difficult for them and try to understand where some of those emotional hangups are. All right, it sounds like MI is what Dee was asking about, so that's good. I do have a little bit more in the presentation, so I can go, but I want to make sure that we have time for conversation too. Okay, I have a question from an anonymous attendee. Are these interventions most often deployed via apps or also other modalities? So I would say right now I'm seeing a lot of work in the app space. And when I originally started writing Engaged, actually, we struggled so much with the title. And it's funny because I think our working title was engaged all along. So after all that struggle, we didn't even change it. But originally, we were specifically going to have it focus on digital product design because that is where a lot of behavior change design has focused in the last few years. And I will say behavior change design has always looked at the context as well, because we understand that behavior changes don't take place on the screen. So the app is delivering something that's intended to change behavior in the real world, and that means we have to understand it. But then the guts of the intervention, typically in my professional experience, have been the app. Recently in the last few years, and this may partly be an artifact of my working for MadPow, where we have a service design capability, we've also been focusing on, more analog, offline, service-oriented interventions. And I know that there are all kinds of interventions that are developed outside of what I would call the UX design community that are not digital modality. So I am having a hard time answering the question because I think that my answer is really colored by where I sit in the professional world, in this UX community. But yeah, a lot of my work at least includes an app or a screen in some way. All right, I can quickly say one thing people have asked me a lot too, so I kind of have prepared to answer it, is how do they start doing some of this stuff themselves? And actually, a few years ago, I was part of a panel at UXPA International when it was in Puerto Rico about, should you get a PhD to work in UX? And there was a panel of several of us who have PhDs, I think all in psychology or cognitive science. And ultimately, as a panel, I think we agreed that no, first of all, you definitely don't need a PhD to work in UX. I think we all know that. But the value of the PhD is, it's like if you're a research nerd who really likes this sort of thing and you want to devote that kind of time and energy to building that particular specialized skill set, it can be really worthwhile. But for most people, you're able to build a lot of the same skills, and build a flavor of what you get out of that program through professional experience or through other educational experiences. And so, I think here are a few starter steps if you are someone who works in UX and you have never really done anything in behavior change and you want to start bringing some of this in. So first is just definitely start small. You don't have to all of a sudden convert your entire process to behavior change design. And in fact, that is probably not a good idea because, you want to build from a place of strength. But as you try a tactic or two, you'll figure out what works for you, and you can either incorporate that, build on it, use it more, or you can drop it from the process. And not everything needs behavior change design either. Like, as I mentioned, a lot of human-centered design projects don't necessarily seek to change a behavior. And so in that case, you don't really need to use these approaches. But if you are trying to change someone's behavior, it can be useful to bring some of this stuff in. Some of the specific tactics that I find are easier for people at the beginning are, first of all, literature review. So there's all kinds of databases and things online where you can look at published articles and get a sense for what has worked or not worked in the past. And in fact, you can even oftentimes find an existing review article. Normally, I wouldn't stop at finding a review article, but if you're new to it, like just reading the review article can start to give you a flavor for how to build on previously done work in behavior science. That outcomes logic map that I showed, where you take your baseline data and then you take your kind of long-term outcomes and you fill in the black box in between, that can be a really useful exercise that is accessible to new behavior change designers. And then the third one that I didn't talk about specifically, but when you're doing your brainstorm, do a lens brainstorm. So instead of just saying, how could we solve this problem, say, how could we solve this problem? And let's focus right now on solutions that fall under the category of, and two specific sets of lenses that I find really fruitful are, that COM-B model I talked about, capability, opportunity, motivation. Okay, let's do some brainstorming about what capability issues might exist or what capability solutions we might think about. And then the other one are the 3 basic psychological needs from self-determination theory: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So you can use those as lenses as well. And you don't necessarily have to have brought that theory into the full process of product development. It can be a way to inject just a little bit of it and benefit from it. And then I have a bunch of advice, I guess, about just being mindful about growing your skill set. And I feel like so much of my learning has been on the job. So to me, that's a really natural way to think about education once you're out of school, if you're not interested in going back to school, which I am definitely not. And remembering that you can call on experts. So there's a growing community of people who specialize in behavior change design. And I think as a community, we're really excited to share what we do with other people, really happy to talk to people. So yeah, just, you can reach out and have those relationships. I have a question here about my perspective on the hooked model and habit forming approaches versus behavior change. So for those of you who may not be familiar, there's actually habits are definitely having a moment right now. I know BJ Fogg has a new book out. James Clear wrote a book called Atomic Habits that I thought was very good. And then Hooked is Nir Eyal's book that he wrote a few years ago that's also been very popular. I don't tend to actually use that work a lot in my practice because I find for the types of behaviors that I'm targeting, they have limited utility. So I tend to think of hooked and habit formation as things that are really useful for these sorts of episodic behaviors. And, a lot of times the things that I'm working on have a really thorny motivational component to it. So like take medication adherence. You could think of it as a habit, right? If it's just memory, like I've got to remember to take this pill every day. So I'm going to set up a scenario where, I put the pills next to the coffee maker and then I remember and problem solved. And that might work for some people. Like for some people, the issue with medication adherence is simply that they forget to do it. So that's a habit formation approach. However, what I find with a lot of the work that I do, where it's often people with these really, serious chronic conditions, it's not just a memory problem. That's not really the reason why they're not taking their medication. Sometimes it's that there are really serious side effects. Sometimes it's they can't afford the medication. A lot of times there's actually kind of more psychological stuff going on. They feel like this is a medication for old people or sick people, and I'm not that. I'm young and vibrant, and I just happen to have this health condition. And so you have to think about the problem using a more complex toolkit. So, I wouldn't say I never use those approaches, but I just find that often I need to get something that's a little bit more, I don't know what the right word is, but, a little bit more in depth, I guess. I do think that both of those can work really well when you're thinking about interface design. Like, how do I make this thing actually sticky? How do I build in the mechanics of the design so that people want to come back and use this often? I've got 2 boxes with questions, so I'm trying to do both of them. Do I have a community in Telegram discussing behavior change? I actually don't know what Telegram is. So no, I don't. I will say how I meet people, how I start these conversations with people that I don't know. LinkedIn, a lot of times, if you are going to link in with me, please put a note. I get a lot of random LinkedIns and I tend not to answer them if I don't know. But even if you just put hey, saw your UXPA thing, I would accept that and be happy to talk there. I put my email address at the beginning, so if people email me, I try to be at least eventually responsive. I'm pretty busy day to day, so I don't always do it right away, but I try to, I will almost never ignore you forever. Twitter, and then there are a couple of online communities for people who are practicing behavior change, but I've been told not to just invite the world. All right, so how do I recommend that cognitive psychology PhDs get into behavior change design? That's an interesting question. And I think that, probably similarly to the way that I did, which is on the job. And I will say when I was starting my career, I knew that I did not want an academic job, which is what I was trained for. That's usually a PhD program is training you to become a professor, go on the tenure track, or to be an academic researcher. And I kind of the only thing I knew was that I didn't want to do that. And so I took a leap of faith and took a research job at an agency as my very first job. Wasn't quite the right fit, but kind of gave me enough direction to get my next job, which was the right fit. I think getting involved directly in a role where you're doing design can be really helpful. And I also think that now there is a lot more understanding among, tech companies and companies doing design of the value that a PhD background in behavior science can bring. So when I was starting my job, I actually had a couple early job interviews where the interviewer would be like, why are you here? You clearly don't actually want this job. I can't imagine that I would get that now. And I've seen so many more companies that are specifically looking for people with a behavior science background to bring into their design team, or to maybe sit on a different team that collaborates with the design team. So I guess my advice would just be to try to do it on the job, whether that means applying for a role that specifically looks at that. Oh, and also I will say this too. and this is something I'm sensitive to as a woman, there's data that shows that men will often apply to jobs where they only meet whatever percentage of the criteria that are laid out in the job description. And for women, it's much higher. So I'm making up these numbers, but let's say men will apply to a job if they meet 40% of the criteria. And for women, they need to meet 80% of the criteria before they feel confident to send in that application. And so one of the things that I try to specifically say to people, and it's kind of like research is research, I'm saying it to myself too, because as a woman, I'm aware that I do this. Don't feel like you have to have every bullet point in a job description to apply for it. A lot of the first jobs I applied for, like, they weren't looking for people with PhDs in psychology, but they might have been looking for someone who could do research or who could write like a really good insights document, and I can do those things. So don't necessarily feel limited that you don't have a design background. Make the case like, hey, I can do this job because I have all these great skills. All right. I don't see any other questions right now, but feel free to throw it in the box. I think the discount, I can see that the discount code's going here. I think it's actually UXPA 0620. That's the format that they've been using. All right, someone here is saying that they're PhDs in behavior analysis, trying to transition into UXR, getting through to recruiters has been unsuccessful. Okay, so a couple things here. First of all, I have had no luck with recruiters in my career. Like that's seriously like repeatedly been a form of frustration for me, especially because I have a couple of good friends who are in consulting and like they're not behavior change experts, but like they're actually working on kind of similar problems, and like recruiters are falling out of the sky. And I think part of it is that like, this is still a pretty new field, and I don't know that recruiters know what to do with us yet. So I've just kind of learned not to rely on recruiters. Peoplescience.com, they have a job board for behavior science roles that might be worth checking out. I'm not sure how much they're maintaining it right now in the pandemic because so many companies have gone on hiring hiatuses. And there is also a Google Doc that, so this is Megan, if you shoot me a note so that I have your email address, I'll send you a link to this, but there is a Google Doc that someone else made that is a it's not complete, it's comprehensive, it's large, but it's companies all around the world that hire behavior change people. So I'm happy to share the link to that. I didn't create it, but it's a publicly available Google Doc. And so I can send you the link to that. And I found that it's a helpful resource because it starts to give you a sense of the type of companies that might hire people with a behavior change background, and also whether they're hiring them specifically for that or if they're hiring them in other teams for the skill set. All right. Yes, and someone here said I have a psychotherapy background. Sounds like behavior change design will fit my role. When I was with, I spent a number of years working for a startup, health media, that was then acquired by Johnson & Johnson, and it's really where I think I became a behavior change designer. And most of my behavior change colleagues were clinical psychologists, so that skill set lent itself so well to the design of health behavior change. And everything I know about motivational interviewing, actually, I learned from them and from working with them. So yes, psychotherapy and clinical skills, I think, definitely translate into behavior change design, especially if you are focusing on an area like health, where the alignment is just really good. All right, we're pretty much at time, and I don't see any other questions. Here, I'm going to go back to the first slide here, just so you have my contact information. If you want to reach out, please do. My email address is abucher@madpow.net. .com works as well. And then my Twitter is amybphd. So I hope to see you all on the interwebs.